Summary of Patrick Lecture 170, Fear of Bliss versus Longing for It. And I split this into two parts, doing November and December, because I wanted to establish what bliss was before we worked on why we might be afraid of it. It is my interpretation that a lot of people don't understand how much bliss is already in their lives. Bliss is thought of as a wow factor. There's a principle that if you have the same thing all the time, you become inured to it. You don't see it anymore. It becomes wallpaper. So that you may have a great deal of bliss in your life. You do have a great deal of bliss in your life, and you don't see it because it's become invisible. Now, what would that represent? That would be being able to breathe easily. Right now I have a hoarse throat, but it doesn't hurt. So I'm certainly not, it doesn't feel unpleasant or difficult. I know that it sounds a bit odd, so that I'm wondering what that is, but I'm not disturbed by it necessarily. That's a form of bliss. My throat works, my voice works. Those of you who have had sore throats or laryngitis or other issues know how incredible the voice can be because it just comes out of you naturally. Another example I use are your internal organs, which don't usually have sensory, they don't give you sensations normally. You might not feel well, but you can't necessarily tell the difference between your pancreas and your liver. You have a generic kind of feeling that something's not right. But when they work correctly, you don't have any feeling of them. And what we miss is how blissful it is not to have any sensation because everything's working. So one of the definitions that I grabbed onto, I came from another lecture, is that bliss is a feeling that everything's right in the universe. Bliss is the feeling that there's nothing wrong right now, and that there's nothing inherently wrong in the whole organization of spirituality and human nature, even though we may encounter unpleasant situations. So that's the bliss part that I did last month. This part's about the fear of bliss. What's that about? And I divided it into 4 groups. Fear of bliss, 3 levels of fear, facing our no to bliss, and accepting truth as equivalent to accepting happiness. So in terms of fear of bliss, think of this like fear of success, fear of love, fear of becoming famous, becoming more noticed. We fear the unknown in any form, whether it's going to be, we think it's going to be pleasant or unpleasant. Fear of bliss is a fear of, well, what's going to happen if I become blissful? Will I have to make more? Will I have to work harder? Will I have more responsibilities? What's going to go on? What do I have to pay for this bliss? It's a misunderstanding of bliss. Just like fear of success is a misunderstanding of the obligations that do come with success, but you still have free agency and free choice in that process. What we lose sight of is that we can control the process, but we may not know how to. So instead of being afraid of bliss, consider translating this or shifting your attitude about this to what would bliss mean? What would it change? What would life be like? I might feel more responsibility because I might feel freer. So one definition of bliss is that it is growth and expansion. Well, if I expanded and I grew, maybe more work or more responsibility wouldn't be a problem. It may be a problem from where I am, and I'm projecting that into a situation where I felt more blissful. So the fear of any growth or expansion, success, love, happiness, will affect your being able to cope with bliss. Also, the reality is that if you are afraid of bliss and you reject it, you can't really have pleasure. You can't subdivide your humanity because your humanity, according to the Pathfic teachings, is divine. Everything is divine. Dogs are divine, horses, cats, grasshoppers, clouds. Everything has a divine element to it. When you reject pleasure, you are rejecting part of the divine, which is the essence of bliss. So that when we reject bliss, we in effect reject some form of pleasure. We're trying to truncate and subdivide and micromanage this, and we'll eventually lose all of it. So the guide talks about 3 levels of fear. Talks about where fear is stronger than desire. And when that happens, when your fear of bliss is stronger than your desire for bliss, which is natural and normal, that you're going to become stagnant and desperate. You're going to feel trapped. That's one level. The second level is when it's evenly divided. There's a school in pathwork known as 50-50, and its premise is you get good days and bad days, and you get good days again. So that life doesn't have to be perfect for it to be overall pleasurable. If the fear and desire are equally managed, then it'll feel like that. Some areas will work. Some areas where you allow blissful feelings will flow and work and expand. You'll feel growth there. And areas where you don't allow bliss, feel bliss, reach out and receive the bliss that you can have anytime you wish to open your mind to it, because it's an attitude, then those areas are going to be stagnant, and you'll feel a sense of desperation there. The third level of fear is when desire is stronger than fear. And when that happens, it's easier to overcome. The blocks, the obstacle defenses, they're not as huge. Your desire is going to leap over. It's going to overflow the banks of any fears. So it's going to be easier to work once the desire is stronger than the fear. And that's the other reason I felt that it was important to get what bliss is straightened out, so that the desire for bliss would increase and you could just leap over your fear. This section talks about consequences of fear. And that is that when you live in fear, when you live in contraction and fear and trying to protect yourself, ultimately there's a sense of futility, of helplessness, self-pity, and bitterness. It can't be helped. It's not good space to grow. Human beings want to grow. If we want to see what human beings are meant to be, look at children. I know that children misbehave, but looking aside the fact that they need to be socially trained and controlled in some way, look at how joyous they can be, how free they can be, how eager they are, how enthusiastic, and with good parenting, good teachers, good support systems, where their tendencies can be modified gently and lovingly, and their pluses can be addressed and supported and allowed to flow. Look at how there's no self-pity, there's no helplessness, there's no bitterness in a child when it's nurtured and loved and exposed to wonderful things to learn and explore. So all these things are the consequences, these 4 things that I named, the consequences of allowing fear to control your life. So the guide says very often, don't take his word for it. Find out for yourself. And this is where it has to become experiential. I have started some workshops in November and December, and will continue them into 2022, because I want to try new ways to get this off the page and get this into an experiential setting where it can be discussed. And one of the exercises we did in the first workshop was we said one thing and energetically meant another in small groups. And one participant said that that was a revelation, because what happened was they started to remember all the times they'd had that confusion in their mind, what's being said, mixed messages. We know these phrases, but we don't connect the dots. We don't connect those moments of not being sure and feeling mixed messages and trying to figure out what's going on. We don't interpret that with the reality that someone may be saying one thing and energetically expressing the other. So sometimes it's helpful to have an experience of this, Now, you can do this anytime in your life. Your life is a workshop. So where the consequences of fear are concerned, find an area where you're fearful, and honestly look at it. Honestly see what happens when you are afraid. So the third section was facing our no. This gets a little complicated because there is a no that is a defense against misunderstood experiences. We have grown and expanded and gotten into trouble. We have grown and expanded, gotten into somebody's way, and they have yelled at us. We blame the desire for that. We blame the expansion for that, instead of understanding, like children, that you have to be careful where you play or you'll knock things over. So in facing our no, this is where if there's no bliss, there's no pleasure. Here's where if there's no pleasure, there's no bliss. And so the no to bliss, I will not get involved with the divine. I will not explore that area. I'm not interested in growth and expansion. I just want pleasure. That's not going to work. The pleasure will diminish in its effect because it's limited. Even pleasure wants freedom. Part of pleasure is freedom, the freedom to explore, the freedom to feel. So that if you try to negate one, you'll negate the other. So that's in facing our no. What I like to do is I like to dramatize what are very subtle aspects of human life by making them bigger. So Guide talks very often about how we normally overemphasize, exaggerate, and dramatize things so that it's not realistic how we're talking about them. However, it's useful to exaggerate and over-dramatize situations so that we can see small things more clearly and blow them up a little bit. So I suggest to people that you invite your no out to play. Find that no, bring it out, and have a conversation with it. Let it talk. Let it speak what it thinks the results will be if it says no to bliss. If it says no to anything, listen to it just like you would listen to a child or an adult who was misinformed, and begin to see the fallacy in what it's saying. You can see it, but you have to have a little distance. When it comes from inside, sometimes it's too close to us, so we can't tell the difference. But when you hear your own voice, when you write a list out and you let the no have its words, and then you sit back and look at it, you'll get a different sense of what that no means. It won't feel protective. It will feel as if it diminishes you. Fear will feel like what it is. Your no will feel like what it is. So invite it out to play and get it talking. Another aspect of your no is because it's a form of self-rejection or rejection of the human condition. They are the same, but they're different aspects of the same rejection. So that I reject myself. You're fine. I'm the problem. I'm just not good enough. What I say to people is, why are you an exception to the law of brotherhood? If the law of brotherhood is universal, that the goal is to love everyone, everything, but we'll restrict us to humans for the moment. If the goal is to love everyone, why are you the only exception? Oh, well, there's me and there's 500 or 600 or 700 more. It's not a law if there's that many exceptions. And this is not a human law that was written by humans and therefore requires exceptions. This is a spiritual law. The law of brotherhood dictates that how you treat one person diminishes any love you think you have for everyone. That the goal is love for everyone. Love does not mean allowing. Love does not mean, if I love you, I let you do anything you want. Love may mean tough love. It may mean putting you aside and bordering you, bounding you, so that we can restrict the worst impulses of human beings. That can be done with love. We can do that to ourselves. That is quite different than self-rejection. Self-rejection is the equivalent of I'm bad and I reject bad. Now, the other side of self-rejection of ourselves is rejecting the human condition. It's kind of the same thing. It's a little bit more highbrow. It's a little bit more elegant and intellectual. I just reject the human condition. I just think that it's ridiculous that we have to undergo this. It's a way of trying to rise above the issues that you're having. Also, in path work, to reject the human condition is to reject your reason for coming here in the first place. So by rejecting the human condition, we're trying to find a back door to say no to things that spiritually, according to path work, we said yes to. We said yes to the human experience. We said, yes, this will help me face something. And to reject the difficulties of facing it is a way of rejecting what we've come here to do. And the last section was about how accepting truth is the equivalent of accepting happiness. Perhaps you can see at this point a theme. Can't divide this thing up and say, I'm only going to take this bit, I don't want the other bit. When we want to accept happiness, happiness involves being aligned with truth. Now, once again, I'm not talking about which facts to believe. I'm speaking of spiritual truth. So for instance, in the previous month, one of the elements that we looked at that I wanted to expand so I could make a point with it is that real love brings bliss, and that the majority of human beings exercise a form of false love to a certain number of people, perhaps not everyone in your environment, but to a certain number of people in your environment. So that we can say we love somebody when we're really trying to get something from them, or they fit our needs. We feel comfortable and safe in their presence, means that they're giving us safety. And if they didn't give us safety, our feelings would collapse, our feelings would lower dramatically. Real love is not something you exchange for something. Real truth is not something you beat someone over the head with. Real truth just is. So once again, I like to bring this down to something simple and, generally speaking, not argued about. Truth is like gravity. There's a law of gravity. You can bend it, you can twist it, you can use motors to pull yourself away, spaceships to escape the pull of gravity. But gravity is a thing. And we were born on this planet and we react to gravity. We are grounded on this planet. To reject that is to reject the truth of who we are. It's silly to reject the reality of gravity. That's what I mean in the sense of accepting truth. Not your version of what gravity's force is, not arguing your numbers about gravity, but rather attempting to deny the very existence of something that is indisputable. Now, when we go into spiritual work, the dilemma is that it is disputable. It's invisible. And we can get away with lying and getting paid for it and getting accolades for it for a significant period of time, if not an entire lifetime. I hope I can say this in the sense that I intend for it to be heard, and that is the spirit world laughs at us for thinking that, well, we got away with it for a lifetime. That's not very much time. That doesn't mean much in spirit. There's a larger existence for our beingness than a single lifetime. But what it does is if you get away with lying, cheating, and stealing for an entire lifetime, the message that you send to others is you can do it too. And you are inviting them to attempt to do it. Now, you may, for whatever karmic reasons, be allowed to skate through a lifetime and not seem to pay a penalty. However, when I read biographies of people, I usually find that the actual truth of their existence is different from the mythology that we create around it. I find that people who lie, cheat, and steal are not basically happy people. And the pathwork explanation for that is that it is very, very difficult to constantly try to beat the system, to live a happy life in untruth. It's actually quite hard to do. It's like swimming against the current. You can do it for a while, and then you rest and the current moves back on you. Once again, speaking of this kind of truth as gravity. You can bounce, you can trampoline, you can fly in spacecraft, you can fly in airplanes, but that's more about using the laws of nature than defeating gravity. You haven't defeated gravity at all. You're simply using the system and finding a way to exercise some movement rather than just jumping up and down on the planet and having to bop down every few seconds. So I don't mean to diminish spiritual truth, but I find that we make it too intellectual and too big. And so I keep bringing it down to things that are simpler. Hope that helps understand, or if nothing else, intrigue you to read the lecture, Pathway Lecture 170 on the fear of bliss versus the longing for it. The lectures in between 170 and 175 have been of great interest to me since September, and I have focused on them, which is a bit unusual. I usually bounce around a little bit, but it's just that they seem to interconnect so wonderfully that one leads to another, which leads to another. So I have hung around in this area. So thanks for listening. And because this is going to be done for December, I hope that if you have holidays, that you have joyous ones. Thanks.